Someone you know gets bad news. A promotion falls through. A relationship collapses. A project they poured themselves into fails, publicly. And for one moment, a fraction of a second, you would never speak aloud. Something in you relaxes. Not relief that it wasn't you. Something more specific, more personal, and considerably more disturbing than that. Something that had everything to do with him. You didn't cause this. You didn't consciously wish for it. But when it arrived, part of you felt something close to satisfaction. A small settling, like a weight redistributed. And then, almost immediately, the guilt. Because decent people don't feel that. Generous people don't feel that. People who genuinely care about their friends don't feel that. Except they do. Constantly. Quietly. Across cultures, across centuries, documented in experimental conditions that made researchers uncomfortable to publish. This isn't a character flaw exclusive to broken people. It isn't the dark residue of a few damaged or competitive personalities. It is replicated in psychology labs, described in philosophical texts stretching back 2,500 years, and so structurally ordinary that there is a word for it in at least a dozen languages. The reason it disturbs us is not because it's rare, it's because it isn't. Psychologists call the pleasure part schadenfreude, a German compound that does what English wouldn't dare. It combines the words for damage and joy into a single, unflinching noun. Pleasure from another person's misfortune. But schadenfreude is the symptom. The underlying condition is envy. And envy is something considerably older, stranger, and more structurally embedded in human cognition than most people want to sit with. It is not a mood. It is a mechanism. Envy is not jealousy, though the two are routinely conflated. Jealousy is triangular. It involves losing something you already have, a relationship threatened by a third party, a position that feels destabilized. Envy is different in structure and in target. Envy is the pain generated by someone else's advantage in a domain that matters to you. It carries an asymmetry, a precise awareness of a gap between you and another person. And it is the gap itself, not the object, not the achievement, that generates the psychological charge. Aristotle identified the mechanics of this with unusual precision in the Rhetoric. He wrote that envy is pain caused by the good fortune of an equal, not a celebrity, not an abstract success story operating at an untouchable altitude. An equal, someone near, someone similar in age and circumstance and aspiration, someone whose success illuminates by contrast exactly where you are. The closer the comparison, he understood, the more the pain. The philosopher Helmut Skoke spent decades building what remains one of the most comprehensive accounts of envy in Western thought. Published in 1966 under the blunt title Envy, A Theory of Social Behavior, his argument was provocative in the most serious way. Envy is not an occasional emotional disruption, but a permanent structural feature of human societies. One that shapes law, custom, religion, and political systems from the ground up. Every mechanism of social leveling, every norm against standing out, every cultural pressure toward false modesty, is partly a technology for managing the mutual envy between people who are forced to live in proximity. Leon Festinger formalized the comparison process in 1954 with his social comparison theory. The observation that human beings have a fundamental automatic drive to evaluate their own abilities and standing by comparing themselves to others. We do not assess ourselves in the abstract. We assess ourselves in relation. And when that relation turns unfavorable, when the comparison runs upward, and we are the lower term, the emotional response is not neutral observation. It is destabilization. Richard Smith, a psychologist at the University of Kentucky, has spent more time than perhaps anyone studying the precise machinery of envy and schadenfreude, with results that are difficult to read without a certain self-recognition. In one of his studies, participants were asked to read about a highly successful student, someone who appeared to have everything going for them. When that student later experienced a significant setback, participants reported feeling better, not neutral at the news. Better. And the more enviable the target, the more pronounced the pleasure at their failure. What makes Smith's findings particularly precise is the specificity of the effect. The pleasure wasn't generalized. It didn't extend to all misfortune everywhere. It intensified in direct proportion to how envied the target was, how similar they were to the observer, and how relevant their domain of success was to the observer's own identity. A writer feels more schadenfreude watching a rival writer stumble than watching a physicist fail. A musician, more from a better musician's collapse than from anyone else's. The closer the mirror, the more satisfying the cracks. Dutch researchers Niels van de Ven, Marcel Zelenberg, and Rick Pieters contributed an important distinction in 2009 by identifying two structurally different forms of envy, benign and malicious. Benign envy, they argued, generates upward motivation. The envious person wants to close the gap through their own effort, to become more like the person they envy. Malicious envy moves in the opposite direction entirely. The goal isn't to rise. It's to pull the other person down, to eliminate the advantage, to level. Not to have what they have. To ensure they no longer have it either. The switch between these two forms appears to be governed largely by perceived legitimacy. If the envied person's success seems deserved, earned through genuine effort, talent, sacrifice, benign envy is more like. If the success appears unearned, undeserved, lucky, or somehow unfair, malicious envy takes hold. And here is where the psychology becomes particularly interesting. People are not neutral evaluators of legitimacy. They are strongly motivated, under the pressure of envy, to find the advantage undeserved. The rationalization runs fast and deep. There is a hypothesis in evolutionary psychology, sometimes called the leveling mechanism. In small-scale ancestral environments, concentrated advantage in one individual was genuinely destabilizing. It disrupted resource sharing, warped status hierarchies, created asymmetries that threatened group cohesion. A psychological system that monitored and resented and sought to undermine individuals who accumulated too much would have served a real adaptive purpose. Envy, in this reading, is not a malfunction. It is an inheritance. A monitoring system from an environment where inequality was genuinely dangerous. The anthropological record supports this reading with uncomfortable consistency. Across cultures, from hunter-gatherer bands in the Amazon to early agricultural societies across 3 continents, there are elaborate social norms against visible success. Leveling behaviors, the pressure to redistribute, to perform modesty, to downplay achievement. What anthropologists call the culture of envy management. These aren't isolated cultural quirks. They appear too often, too widely, to be coincidence. Alexis de Tocqueville, writing about American democracy in the 1830s, noticed something counterintuitive about egalitarian societies, where formal hierarchies are abolished, and the language is one of equal opportunity, he observed. Envy does not diminish, it intensifies. Because in a genuinely level playing field, the success of another person becomes much harder to explain away. There is no aristocratic birth to blame, no inherited advantage to point to. The gap between you and the person who succeeded looks, in an egalitarian framework, like a gap that reflects something about you. That is precisely when envy becomes most corrosive, when there is no external explanation left. In workplaces, this manifests in patterns that are recognizable, but almost never named. The colleague who doesn't quite celebrate your promotion. The slightly delayed congratulations. The person who asks probing questions about your successful project in a meeting, not to understand it better but to locate a flaw. The small persistent footnotes added to your successes by people who otherwise seem perfectly well-meaning. These aren't aberrations. They're ordinary behaviors in ordinary offices, performed by people who would be genuinely horrified to be identified as envious. This is what makes envy particularly difficult to address. It is almost always unconscious in the person experiencing it. People do not generally feel themselves as envious. They feel themselves as having legitimate concerns, reasonable reservations, valid observations. The person undermining a colleague's work genuinely believes they are raising a fair point. The person who subtly disparages a friend's new relationship genuinely believes they're just being realistic about what they're seeing. The rationalizing machinery is extraordinary. It converts envy into principle, into care, into intellectual skepticism, so smoothly that the original emotion becomes invisible even to the person it's moving through. The proximity effect Aristotle identified has been confirmed repeatedly by modern research. We envy most intensely those who are similar to us in relevant ways. In age, in profession, in life stage, in background. The friend who gets the book deal. The sibling who earns more. The colleague hired at the same time who advances first. These are the relationships carrying the most envy load. And they are also the relationships we are most motivated to protect, to idealize, to describe as close and loving and genuinely supportive. The result is a compound structure of real affection and real resentment that most people carry for years without ever giving the resentment its accurate name. Friedrich Nietzsche identified the broader social version of this and gave it a name: resentment. He was describing something slightly different from envy in its personal form. A moral revaluation that occurs when people who feel unable to change their circumstances convert resentment into a comprehensive framework where their weakness becomes virtue and others' strength becomes vice. It is the psychology underneath sanctimonious criticism of success, the celebration of failure disguised as principles, the way institutions and entire cultural movements can organize themselves around the punishment of anyone who rises too visibly above the average. Resentment, Nietzsche thought, was the engine behind a great deal of what presents itself as morality. If you've been sitting with this long enough, you've probably started locating it. The specific people in your life whose setbacks produce a sensation that feels different from ordinary sympathy. The particular domains in which other people's success becomes difficult, specifically, to celebrate. The patterns in how you discuss high achievers when they aren't in the room. The qualifications you add, the footnotes, they had certain advantages. I heard they're actually not as... These are not random conversational habits. They are indicators of something operating just below the surface of your stated values. Recognizing malicious envy in yourself is one of the more uncomfortable cognitive experiences available to a person. It runs directly against the self-concept most people maintain, that they are fundamentally generous, not petty, not the type to want someone else to fail. And the discomfort of that recognition tends to produce one of two responses. Either it generates genuine recalibration, a more honest accounting of your reactions, a greater vigilance about the motives behind behavior toward people whose success unsettles you, or the discomfort itself becomes motivation and bury the recognition deeper. To construct more elaborate rationalizations, to project the pettiness outward and locate, in others, what you can't tolerate finding in yourself. The psychologist Karen Horney, writing in the mid-20th century, described what she called the tyranny of the should, the gap between how people believe they ought to feel and how they actually feel, and the neurotic suffering generated by that gap. Envy sits precisely in this space. You should feel happy for your friend. You should celebrate this. You don't, or not entirely. And the shame around that non-feeling is often more paralyzing, more consuming than the envy itself, because the envy at least has a target. The shame just turns inward. There is a reading of all this that is simply dark, that we are, beneath the social performance of warmth and generosity, fundamentally comparative creatures who want the people nearest us to fail in proportion to how much they threaten our sense of where we stand. And that reading is not entirely wrong. The experiments are real, the mechanisms are documented, and the scale at which this operates, from intimate friendships to civilizational value systems, is not easily dismissed. But there is another reading, and it doesn't require optimism to hold it. The fact that envy generates shame, that people hide it, rationalize it, are disturbed by it when they glimpse it clearly, suggests something. Aristotle placed envy among the emotions for which there is no appropriate moderate expression. Unlike anger or fear, which can be felt rightly or wrongly depending on circumstance, envy, he argued, is always pointing in the wrong direction. Kant called it one of the vices of hatred of humanity, not merely a failing but an active orientation against human flourishing. These are not casual dismissals. They are attempts to name something that the species has consistently recognized as wrong, even while continuing to feel it. What envy actually illuminates is the depth of how relational our sense of self is. We do not know who we are in isolation. We construct who we are in comparison. And that comparison dependence means that the success of people near us is never purely their success. It is information about us, about the gap, about the distance between what we are and what we thought we might become. The emotion is a measurement instrument. And like all measurements, it tells you something true. The question is whether you are willing to read it accurately. The question is not whether you will feel it. You will. The question is what you do with the information. Whether you let it operate underground, shaping behavior you'll explain as principle or concern or realism, or whether you hold it still long enough to see what it's actually pointing at. Not at them, at you, at the distance between where you are and where you haven't managed to get, and the weight of carrying that distance in a world that gives you almost no permission to name it honestly.